Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out despite this really awful weather. My name is Lauren Wolf. I am the Senior Program Manager here at the Columbia Global Centers. I don't know if you've been here before, but this whole little compound that you wouldn't suspect is here has belonged to Columbia for over 50 years. And the Global Centers, it was mostly known for the undergraduate program. The Global Centers came here in 2010, and just recently we opened the doors for the new Institute for Ideas and Imagination, which has brought artists and scholars together. So tonight we're so delighted to welcome back Alex Cooley from the Harriman Institute. We organized an event with them last year and it went so well we decided to do a second. Yes. So I'm not going to monopolize the mic for very long. I am very grateful to our partners that made this event possible. So the Harriman Institute at Columbia University, SOAS, University of London, SOAS, and the University of Chicago, which is opening a humongous, new kind of expansion of their presence already in Paris. This evening's conversation is called Revealing the Offshore World, How Researchers Investigate Shell Companies, International Wealth Managers, and Transactional Informal Economies. It's going to be moderated by Alex, who is, in my opinion, the best moderator we've ever had, who is the Claire Tow Professor of Political Science at Barnard College, Director of the Harriman Institute for the Study of Russia, Eurasia, and Eastern Europe, and the author of Dictators Without Borders, Power and Money in Central Asia. Thank you so much for coming. I hope you enjoy the conversation.
Wow, Lauren, thank you. After that introduction, I'm just going to stutter my way through the whole proceedings. Thank you again. It's such a pleasure to partner and team up with you. And really excited about today's panel, and just to give you a little bit of background, I'm a post-Soviet scholar, a political scientist by training, and I'm involved in the Russian Studies Institute. But here today we hosted a workshop with scholars from different disciplines and different geographic interests, the Middle East, Africa, post-Soviet Union, looking at the offshore world. And how do we understand the dynamics of the offshore world? And so this is building on a conference we had last year at SOAS, and we'll keep following up on this group. The title, Revealing the Offshore World, is intended to take stock of what exactly do we know as academics and researchers of the offshore world. I think there's been just a few developments that have really thrust the spotlight on what goes on behind the scenes. So the leak of the Panama Papers, for instance, really spotlighted how celebrities, politicians, fixers are part of this world of global company provision. I think there's increasing spotlight about massive wealth in the world and that it's flowing in all directions. Traditionally it flowed west to east, but now it flows east to west as well. We have increasing stories about the purchase of luxury real estate in places like Paris and London and Manhattan from sources that traditionally we didn't consider would be the way that sort of capital flowed. And then we have increasing awareness, I think, about global inequality. Of course, Thomas Piketty's book, but also I think the populist backlash against dynamics, concerns about oligarchs in political systems and what kind of influence that they have. So I think, the bringing together of these factors have made this question of what the offshore world is and how do we study it even more pressing and topical. So we're going to hear today from a group of panelists who, it's no exaggeration to say, these are the leading people in their fields. And they won't say so, but I'll say it on their behalf, they're all incredibly brave. They've pioneered some ingenious research techniques, and they've uncovered, I think, some really important findings in their ethnographic, experimental, historical, and survey work. So I won't give big introductions because they'll tell you about themselves in our first round of questions, but there'll be Jason Sharman from Cambridge University, Brooke Harrington from Dartmouth College, Kimberly Hong from University of Chicago, and Kristen Surak from SOAS. So to kick things off, why don't we have everyone introduce themselves and tell us what part of the offshore world do you study? Why is it important? And feel free to briefly, plug your book or your research in a shameless way for this audience who are sort of captive here. So let's start maybe at the bottom. Jason, why don't you kick us off?
Great, thanks very much. First off, thanks again to the hosts, to Columbia, to Chicago, and to SOAS. I guess I study two bits of the offshore world which are related but not the same thing. And the first one is shell companies, and particularly untraceable or anonymous shell companies. And the second one is kleptocracy or grand corruption. So I'll talk really briefly about both. How's a shell company different from any other kind of normal company? A shell company is one that doesn't really have a substantive business purpose. It doesn't make things, doesn't produce goods or services, it doesn't have employees. It's just basically a legal person. And shell companies, particularly those that can't be linked back to the real person in control, are incredibly useful if you're looking to hide financial affairs. If you're looking to have a bank account, it's much easier to hide what goes on in that bank account and the link to the owner if it's in the name of a shell company rather than a real person. As Alex alluded to, if you've got a big mansion that you've purchased with ill-gotten gains, it's much easier to keep your relationship or your ownership of this mansion secret if you can do it in the name of a shell company rather than in your natural name. I'm interested in shell companies. I speak to people who make them. I've formed some shell companies of my own, both in classic kind of tax haven jurisdictions, but also onshore. And together with Michael Finley and Dan Nilsson, we went on a big mystery shopping expedition for shell companies as well, where we impersonated a rogues gallery of 21 fictitious individuals of high and low risk, and then made thousands and thousands of email solicitations around the world to find out if it was possible to buy a shell company without revealing who we really were, which is directly and expressly in violation of the international standards that are meant to govern shell companies. Very briefly on the second one, kleptocracy or corruption, I'm interested in if you're a really corrupt head of state, senior government official, or maybe a family member of such, and you've stolen a lot of money, engaged in really large-scale corruption, how you move it across borders and hide it. And so I'm particularly interested not so much in the place where money is stolen from, but the processes by which people transfer it to another place and then hide it there.
I'm Brooke Harrington. I'm a sociologist, and I study the people who move money and other things around the world on behalf of kleptocrats and others. Among other things, they create the shell companies. They also create trusts and foundations. Usually what they create is complex structures made up of those three things, custom built, almost like bespoke fashion for their elite clients to hide ill-gotten gains, shares of family companies, yachts, real estate, heaven knows what. If you remember the Panama Papers and the dozens of names you would see in the paper, people who you'd think would have nothing to do with each other, from entertainers like Simon Cowell and Jackie Chan, all the way up to heads of state, and of course corporate leaders. None of those people create their offshore structures. That requires a level of expertise that's beyond even an intelligent and Machiavellian person. You'd have to memorize, or you'd have to be abreast of the legal developments in dozens of different jurisdictions. And that's just too much for any one person. So they employ teams of people under the direction of what's called a wealth manager. And so I wrote a book about wealth managers after joining them. I spent about 2 years in wealth management school to learn how to hide people's assets offshore. Mm-hmm. So if any of you have any ill-gotten gains you've been wondering what to do with, that's the sort of thing I was taught how to do. Any of you could do it too if you've got about $50,000 in 2 years to spare to master law and finance and accounting, even for the purposes of hiding people's assets from tax authorities, from creditors. Because what I found is it's much bigger than tax evasion or tax avoidance. Evasion is the illegal kind. Avoidance is the sketchy but legal kind that we saw in the Panama and Paradise Papers. It's a very widespread practice among people of a certain means. And almost all of them have wealth managers. There's probably a pretty small number of people who do that job for a living, but they're very, very important. They control billions, possibly trillions of dollars of assets going all around the world in a largely frictionless way. That is, without the friction of being tracked or the friction of some sort of regulation, certainly not the friction of taxation. And tax avoidance is really the tip of the iceberg. What wealthy people want typically is to be able to avoid all manner of laws that prevent them from doing what they want to do, and that includes things like paying back creditors or paying out assets to divorcing spouses or giving money to their family under forced heirship rules. You name it, there's probably somebody who wants to avoid it, and it's the wealth manager's job to figure out how to avoid laws that wealthy people find inconvenient without actually formally breaking the law. So their specialty is what the law professor emerita at Oxford, Doreen McBarnett, called creative compliance. It's a real art form. The big four accounting firms do it for corporations, and wealth managers do it for individuals. So I'll look forward to taking your questions about that later.
Great, thanks. Kimberly.
Hi, thanks for coming out in the rain today. So my name's Kimberly Hong, and I'm currently writing a book that's tentatively titled Playing in the Gray: Foreign Investment in Frontier and Emerging Markets. And I actually fell into the world of offshoring. I started the research actually being very interested in foreign investment in Southeast Asia. So the two markets that I focused specifically on are Vietnam and Myanmar. And so I was interested in how do Western and East Asian investors compete to gain a foothold in the region in highly corrupt markets. And particularly in thinking about this with the rise of China and the rise of investments from other parts of East and Southeast Asia in the region. And when I got to Vietnam and Myanmar, it turned out that most all of the investments were controlled offshore in Hong Kong and Singapore. So US investments typically ran through Singapore and Chinese investments ran through Hong Kong. And I think from an ethnographic perspective, what I came to understand was that our statistics actually can't tell us how much money flows from country A to country B, because it turns out that it runs through these very complex circuits. So then I got to Hong Kong and Singapore, and it turned out that those were owned in the British Virgin Islands, Panama, Seychelles, Samoa, and so I sort of stumbled on the project. But I was actually trying to build on Brooke's first book by thinking about a broader network of individuals. So connecting the individuals that are raising capital with those that are sourcing deals to deploy capital. So I did over 300 interviews with essentially owners of capital and the people and the financial professionals who manage their money. So private wealth managers, but also lawyers, accountants, company secretaries, auditors, fixers, public relations folks, and look and sort of map out the architecture of these structures. And so I start in Vietnam and Myanmar, and then go to company secretaries and lawyers that set up the entities in Hong Kong and Singapore, and then ask them to introduce me to those folks that set up the vehicles in BVI. And it's qualitative in nature. So I think when you think about the Panama Papers, for example, you can go in and play with it, and you can map out a network structure, but you actually have no idea about the content that flows through two nodes in a network. So what is the vehicle doing? Why was it set up? How much money flows through it? And so I sort of do, from the bottom up, I think, map the content of what flows through those networks. And I think that I will just say briefly too that what I've uncovered is it's not, at least for the people that I study, in these, they live in states with weak political and financial institutions, and so oftentimes it's not just about tax evasion or avoidance, although that's a big part of it, but it's also about setting up vehicles in places that make them feel secure when they are working in politically unstable economies. So, booking things with in places where they feel have clearer rule of law or arbitration, where they have greater faith in financial institutions because they've lived in countries where banks have routinely shut down. There's been currency crisis, so there were a lot of other reasons for setting up these offshore vehicles beyond just evading or avoiding taxes.
Great. Kristen.
Okay, thanks very much. So in comparison to the other people on the panel, I study a little bit more of what one might consider the personal face of these sorts of things, and that I look at the market in citizenship. So there's a global competitive market in citizenship by investment programs, and I'm basically looking at the countries that sell it, the wealthy people who buy it, and the intermediaries who make the market. But all of those are actually much more complex than what that shorthand I just gave you says. So if you look at what it means to sell citizenship, I'm really looking at formal citizenship by investment programs. So there's currently 10 countries that offer this. You can go on websites and find out from the government exactly what is required of this, what the time frame is, what the minimum investment is, what the due diligence standards are, in a very formal, policy model for granting citizenship in exchange for either an investment in the country in terms of real estate or business, or in a donation to the government. There's 5 countries in the Caribbean with these sorts of programs. In the Mediterranean, there's Malta and Cyprus. There's also Turkey, Moldova, and Jordan, and more countries are in discussion about developing these techniques. The people who buy it, and even then, it's a longer process than what most people think. It takes a couple of months, there's a bureaucratic process, so it's not exactly passports being exchanged for cash under tables. Although, of course, that can happen in a lot of part of the world. That's not what I'm really focusing on. They usually have assets of at least, say, $5 million. They can be largely from places like China, now the Middle East is a second big hub, and Russia as well. So if you look at what's going on in all of these places, we have the growth of a lot of wealth, a large wealthy class, but often in places without, they can have autocratic leaders, or people aren't sure of what's going on. It can be very difficult to move around the world on these passports as well. If you're from Afghanistan, you get visa-free access to about 30 to 35 countries, which, actually if you're in business, you can be in a very legitimate business as well. If you have to park your passport in an embassy every single time you need to move somewhere, it can be very difficult. So there's a lot of reasons that go into why people, what the demand behind this is. For most people, it's an insurance policy. They're just not sure about what's going to go on next. And if you're from China, if you're from Russia, if you're from the Middle East, and that can be a big reason why they look into these options. And it's interesting too in looking at the structure of intermediaries that really make this into a market that connect it. Because they can be involved in, as is the case in a lot of policy areas, involved in drafting policy. This happens, for example, in Washington, D.C. all the time, but also in implementing these programs. And it's interesting then to look at this interface between states and private actors, especially when you're talking about very small states. So some of these states, like the country of St. Kitts, has a population of about 50,000 people. There's not a lot of state resources. It means, for example, that their citizenship by investment program contributes 30 to 40% of GDP in the country. It's a big part of what's going on. It also means when you have a state that's small, there's not a lot of resources as well. So you end up seeing private actors, for example, foreign due diligence companies stepping in where, in the case of the United States, you might have the FBI doing this sort of work, background work. So it's interesting to watch that sort of interface between private actors and the state in these sorts of places. I think it's also interesting because it helps us also rethink citizenship and inequality in different sorts of ways. So we often think, these are very wealthy people, and so you start thinking about inequalities within countries. But when you start looking at citizenship, you begin thinking about what are inequalities between countries as well. I would guess that probably most people in this room have a very nice North Atlantic citizenship, probably a lot in France, but it's a different sort of bargain if you know what citizenship means, what's granted to a person from it, if it's not in a state with a strong rule of law and these sorts of things. So I'm also interested in these kind of intersecting inequalities and how they play out in these sorts of markets.
Right. So just to follow up on that, I would ask each of you to tell us what perhaps are the most popular misunderstandings about the topic that you study, whether it's golden passports or shell companies or high net worth individuals and their managers. And what do we know now, maybe as a result of your research or other colleagues in your field, what do we know now that we didn't know 10 years ago, say? And let's start with Kristen, and we'll go in reverse order.
Go the other way.
Yeah.
So I should also say very quickly, I also do a bit of research on passive residence investment programs. So golden visas, like have gotten into the news quite a bit about in Portugal, Spain, Greece. Half of the countries in the EU, in fact, have golden visa programs where you invest in the country and get residence as well. In terms of misunderstandings, I think part of it is, the way I phrase what I do is I study investment migration. But number one, if you're going to look at what's going on in terms of investment, that has to be qualified. So for example, in Cyprus, if you invest now 2.5 million euros into the country, you and your family can become Cypriot citizens in about 6 months if they're fast, and less than a year. After 3 years, you can sell off 2 million euros of that investment. So the end cost is really the 500,000 that you have to keep in terms of a personal residence in the country, as well as any fees that have gone on in getting it. So a lot of times, once you get citizenship, it's there. It's citizenship. It's there for life. You pass it down, through your family. You can sell off whatever investment it took for you to qualify for citizenship. So understanding what it means in terms of investment going into a country has to be qualified. And the other thing is it's often in terms of investment migration, but number one, most people are not going to the countries where they're becoming new citizens. And in fact, they try to avoid it if at all possible. Sometimes they do have to go. Malta, Cyprus require it. Antigua has a thing about this. But in St. Kitts, you can go to an embassy or you can fly the people out to where you are and swear in as a citizen at your convenience. And it's also, and what's interesting too, it's in a way, it's a little bit about mobility. So if you get citizenship in any of the Caribbean countries, you get 90 days visa-free access to Schengen and to UK, so any of the members of the European Union who are part of the Schengen area. If you become a citizen of Malta or St. Kitts, you are an EU citizen and you can go and reside wherever in the EU you want. So for the moment, that also includes London, which is a very popular destination. So it's not, but this is also still not often a story of immigration. It's a story about people who are mobile and they're setting up different bases around the world for themselves physically, or else it's about a plan B in case things go badly at home. You just don't know about the future. And very wealthy people are very risk averse. They want an insurance policy. And so a lot of this is about, I don't know what's going to go on, so just in case, I want this potential, not even current mobility, but future mobility.
Right.
So I think one of the things that I'm trying to establish in the book is that one of the common misperceptions about offshoring is that it's done by, only. I feel like the way in which it's been covered has been on very high-profile, sensationalized cases. And one of the things that my book is doing is actually looking at much smaller actors in smaller countries who do this on a routine basis every day. And so the volume of, the size of those investments are much smaller. So the investment deals that I study, for example, range from 250,000 to 450 million. So on the grand scheme of what you're seeing in the offshore world, it's actually very small. But the people that I study do it in such a routine way and in very mundane ways that they are not ever publicized in the media. They never show up in these as high-profile cases. And the vast majority of investments that are structured, foreign investments that are structured onshore in both of these two countries are structured offshore. And so there isn't a single investment, joint venture that I've studied that is just a direct investment from one country into Vietnam or Myanmar. And so I think that it lends insight into how they replicated structures that were set up by some of the people that Brooke and Jason study modeled really after Delaware. I mean, people always point back to the US as the architects of these offshore structures that they have taken and replicated, modeled a lot after China through the round-tripping structures between China and Hong Kong. And so, yeah, I think that's one of the common misperceptions, is that it's done by people who have a lot of money, who are high net worth individuals. The other thing that I think the work uncovers is that when we talk about the elite, I think often people don't really differentiate between an elite group that's really stratified, and so a lot of the people that I interview talk about the difference between 1%ers and 3%ers, for example, and that actually, when we cut it that way, it turns out to be a quite significant difference. And so among the people that I study that are part of the sort of 3%ers, they actually are, I call them white-collar slaves in some senses, because they're the private wealth managers who make, $350,000 to $500,000 a year plus carry on return on investment, but actually they're the ones whose names are on all of the documentation, and then the fall guy or woman when something goes awry. But it's the owner of capital, the people who actually own the money that's being invested, whose names never appear on any company, on any public profile, and who largely operate in ways that are completely invisible. And so I think it's really important to differentiate between the professional actors that are shouldering a great deal of risk and those who have the greatest return and smallest amount of risk.
Perfect. Brooke, what should we know about high net worth asset managers that we didn't know?
Gosh, well, picking up on what Kimberly said, the 1% are not a monolithic group. There's an enormous amount of differentiation in there. The people I study, they are elites for sure, but they compare themselves to butlers and social workers for the ultra-rich. They're highly trained professionals. They have to be very knowledgeable about legal systems and financial innovation. In fact, I would argue that the people doing offshore wealth management are driving a lot of legal and financial innovation around the world, because they're always concocting these bespoke structures for their clients. It's like they're like the fashion designers, the Diors of the legal financial world. Every bespoke creation is a unique delight to the intellect as much as a useful device for getting away from whatever law or threat that the client might face. There's been some really interesting work by economists that further shows how much this differentiation is significant. So I got into the 1% by studying wealth managers. But above them are their clients, and the people who are really causing the most difficulties for, say, tax authorities, and who are having the most significant impact on the global political economy in terms of using their offshore wealth to sway elections or to pay off politicians. They're a very small group of people, mid-high six figures, that is a couple 100,000 people. And in some ways, that's really good news. It's not a giant battle against an army of millions. But as Kimberly said, what these folks have attained through the work of their wealth managers is a kind of superpower. They can go invisible. In fact, as I've told everyone at this conference, there's actually a wealth management firm in the UK that has a motto or an advertising slogan that could stand for the entire profession of wealth management, and that is, I want to be invisible. That's what they're selling to clients. Strategic invisibility of their persons, and most importantly, of their assets. Because when you make assets invisible, you can't attach responsibility to them. If your oil tanker springs a leak and pollutes some wetland and somebody has to clean it up, you can't really be held accountable if your wealth manager has done their job. By the same token, you can't be made to pay taxes on an asset that you can't be identified with. You can't be made to cough up that asset in a divorce settlement or in a bankruptcy settlement if you can't be identified with it. So you become not just debt-proof and tax-proof, but law-proof. Thomas Piketty has identified this as being one of the the drivers of alt-right movements, ultranationalist movements all over Europe and North America right now. On the one hand, offshore is literally financing that movements. On the other hand, ideologically, they're aligned, because it's useful to be able to take people who are justly perturbed by the disconnect between their votes and the will of the people and what their governments actually do. It's useful to be invisible to them, because then you can point to people who are essentially powerless and voiceless and say it's their fault. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
Jason.
Thanks. I guess probably two related myths for shell companies and kleptocracy. And I guess when people speak of offshore financial centers or tax havens, the immediate image springs to mind is a beautiful tropical island, probably very small, probably with nice beaches and palm trees. This sense of offshore being out there, far away, exotic and remote. But actually in this mystery shopping expedition that we did with Mike Finley and Dan Nilsson, somewhat to our surprise, we found out that the stereotypical tax havens, the Seychelles in the Indian Ocean, the British Virgin Islands in the Caribbean, and many other places, that in fact places like Britain and the United States were far less compliant with international transparency regulations than the kind of stereotypical tax havens that feature in John Grisham novels or James Bond films. So that in fact it was onshore jurisdictions where you could get, as I say, particularly the United States, which offer much more secrecy via these untraceable shell companies than the classic small island places. And again, similarly for that, for those guilty of grand corruption or who have engaged in kleptocracy, although many of their assets may have transited through classic tax haven jurisdictions, not physically, but usually through the artifice of shell companies and the structure that, kinds of structure that Brooke was talking about. But in fact, those stolen assets don't stay in the Caymans or Liechtenstein. They tend to end up in London, in Paris, in, again, kind of classic onshore jurisdictions. So even the language is kind of weighted. The more you think about it, or at least the more I think about it, the blurrier and the more difficult it becomes to draw a line between what's kind of out there, them, offshore, and what's kind of in here, it's us, onshore.
Great. So I think it would be really intriguing for us to learn about some of the challenges that you've encountered in your research, without giving away all your tricks and your secret techniques. But tell us a little bit about some of the difficulties, some of the workarounds you've had to come up with, some of the innovative methods, and some of the dilemmas maybe that you faced in conducting the research. So maybe Jason, we'll start with you again and come back down.
Thanks. I guess one kind of frustration and puzzle that's motivated a lot of my research is that if you look at the system of international rules designed to stop abuses like tax evasion or corruption or money laundering, they're incredibly impressive. You've got very detailed regulations, you've got treaties, you've got conventions, you've got national laws, you've got regulations, you've got banks that are covered, you've got casinos, real estate agents, lawyers, so on and so forth. The system looks airtight. The only problem is it doesn't really work, or at least we have no evidence to say that it works. We still have a lot of money laundering. We still have a ton of tax evasion. As Kimberly has talked about, that there's still a huge amount of corruption out there. So I'm particularly interested between this gap between what the rules say should happen, what's prohibited, like anonymous shell companies, and what actually happens. And I guess the way I've tried to face that challenge, again, is trying to see how well or how badly the rules work by trying to break those rules and see whether it's possible to get away with it, i.e. to try and buy untraceable shell companies, whether it's possible to enter the financial system anonymously. The second kind of related challenge is, again, this issue of grand corruption or kleptocracy, is that in countries like Australia, where I'm from, but also France, there are very few prosecutions, there are very few court cases that involve the recovery of the stolen wealth. And this could be because, A, there's just not much stolen wealth there to be found, and that's what the governments in question usually say. Or two, there is a lot of dirty money here to be found, but the authorities are either failing to find it, or in fact they're not really trying in the first place. And I think in both the case of France and Australia, it's the government doesn't really care and is not trying to find the stolen wealth. And in order to kind of prove this intuition in Australia, as I say, I did hire a private investigator and we went looking for corrupt wealth, and in fact it was quite easy to find if you were looking for it, unlike the government in question.
Jason, just one follow-up to you. So you sent out these thousands of emails to these different shell company providers, impersonating different types of high risk and low risk figures. Is sending an email soliciting something you're not going to purchase, is that illegal? What kind of terrain were you on there in terms of this kind of deception? And how did you get it through your ethics board at the university?
Sure, we did have to navigate this sort of issue, both the legality of it and then getting ethics. So there are some people you can lie to in writing, and it's not a crime, and other institutions that if you lie to in writing, it is a crime. If you lie to a bank in writing, it's bank fraud, and although we're willing to suffer for our art, it's not to the extent of being criminally prosecuted or chucked in jail. So for the kind of people that form, or the kind of businesses that form shell company, they're in the category where you can lie to them. And deception was a big part of our research. We're impersonating people. We wrote to them and said, we don't like people knowing our business. We don't like paying tax very much, but we do like limited liability. What can you do for us? And particularly what kind of ID? In order to get it through the university, the presumption is you can't use deception in research unless there's a very good reason. And the very good reason that we suggested, or the combination, was that first off, this information is important. We want to know where the rules against financial crime work. Secondly, just asking people, are you following the rules, is not a great way of finding out if they in fact are. And secondly, we don't kind of cause any physical or emotional pain or damage. So we had to suppress all the names of the people that we corresponded with and get rid of the company names as well, in such a way that even if we were subpoenaed and brought to court, we could put our hand on a Bible and say, we cannot get those names. We've deleted them in such a way as it's impossible to recover them.
Super, thanks so much. Brooke, challenges in your field.
It's hard to study what has been made intentionally invisible, and where the costs of investigating have intentionally been made exorbitant. So to what Jason said about governments not finding, or thinking there's little wealth to be taxed, or just not trying, I would add a third reason, which is I know for a fact in some cases in my home country of the United States that the government simply is unable to spend the resources needed to make a case in court. It's one thing to be a researcher and investigate to a sort of social scientific standard what's happening with dirty money offshore. It's quite another thing to investigate to a standard that you can prove a crime in a court of law. And that, for the tax authorities, is the only standard that matters. So if you spend hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars investigating a kleptocrat, and you're pretty sure that he committed some crimes, but you can't prove it, then you've just wasted millions in taxpayer money, and that's a great way to lose your job in government. So it's much easier to prosecute the cases where you can prove that something has been done illegally, and that means prosecuting middle class and working class people who can't afford to hire the creative compliers, the wealth managers who keep them just a millimeter on the right side of the law, even if they flagrantly violate the intent of the law. By the same token, it's difficult and time-consuming and expensive in money terms to study the world of offshore. It's made that way on purpose. There are a variety of reasons why many of the best-known offshore financial centers are in remote locations. Part of it has to do with colonial history, but the reason that so many remote places remain popular is precisely because they are remote, because it costs a lot of money just to physically get there. Jason and I have both been to this place called the Cook Islands. which isn't even a tax haven, it's a debt haven. But if you suspect, as the US government did, that someone is illegally hiding assets there, the US government, for example, successfully prosecuted a fraud case against an author in the US who was bilking people of millions of dollars. They got him for a penalty of $37.5 million. 10 years later, he's paid zero. My government can drone people from 200 feet in the air with precision, but they can't get a con artist, and a pretty lame con artist at that, to cough up 1 penny of a multi-million-dollar court settlement. Why? Because where his wealth manager put his assets, in a Cook Islands Asset Protection Trust, well, it's impossible. No case has ever been won in the Cook Islands. Once you put assets into one of their trusts, they're gone for all intents and purposes. Because you would have to fight it by sending lawyers on the 14-hour flight from Los Angeles and then having them stay at resort prices for weeks or months, and then they have to fight under a legal system that's built with a firewall that basically says any foreign legal challenge is going to probably be preemptively dismissed, and if not, they have to fight under the assumptions of Cook Islands law, which are meant to protect the people who put their assets there against governments like the US and against creditors and anyone who has a claim against that person. It's unwinnable. So how do you study people like that? They don't want to be studied. We can't phone them and say, would you like to do an interview? We can't show up at their places of, places of worship, at their houses. They live in gated communities. They ski at Stad. They're out on their World Cup or America's Cup yachts. I have seriously thought about how to pose a grant application to the National Science Foundation to get funded to go hang out with wealthy people at leisure. But every time I think it through, I'm like, no way. They're going to laugh me out of the review committee because they can't give money for someone like us to go ski with the rich and eavesdrop on their conversations about how they're hiding money offshore. So my next best solution to understand what they were doing and how they did it was to try and understand the bureaucrats, basically, the professionals who actually did the work of moving assets around the world. It's kind of like a strategy of studying rich people by interviewing the butlers and the maids. Pretty effective because they actually know where all the dirt is.
Great. Kimberly.
So I think I had very similar challenges. I mean, I interviewed a number of high net worth individuals, actually, and the people who manage their money. And so in a span of 18 months, I traveled over 350,000 miles, and it was quite dizzying. But I think the purpose of it was to follow the money, to follow people who were raising money all around the world, and then follow them as they were sourcing deals to deploy that capital. And so I think one of the biggest challenges, first of all, was that when I started by going through local newspapers to identify firms and individuals to interview. And I had a team of 13 undergraduate research assistants, five of whom were with me in Asia, and 8 were transcribing interviews back at home. And when we started to go in to do the interviews, what we realized is that most cases never appear in the media because they're trying to stay invisible or once you are in the media, then you have a target on your back for the government to come and issue you back taxes for the deal that you just closed. And so a lot of the methods of triangulation were really challenging. And so a lot of times I just relied on. We actually showed up at people's offices, went to doors, asked people to. It was all done through snowball sampling. So somebody would introduce us to somebody, and after a while, it turned out that it was a pretty small network of people who circuit the same kinds of spaces in ways that, after about 6 months of doing this research, turned out to be far more predictable than I could have ever imagined. And I will say that as a woman who look, Asian and young, oftentimes in a male-dominated world, 90% of the people that I interviewed were men, and my research assistants were men, and so people often thought that I was my student's research assistant, or I had to do a lot of the dirty work, butler work that wealth managers did. So I felt like I was often tested and would ask to do really kinds of outrageous things. Bring special cookies from one country to another as a way of sort of building rapport and trust to get people to talk. But also at the same time, I was non-threatening. And so the kinds of things that people would tell me, particularly people who lost a lot of money in the market, was extraordinary. And so I think that at the time, it was incredibly humiliating to be completely berated next to my students. But I would have to say to them, don't worry, it's good data. Think about all the stuff that they're saying. And I also would say that I was reflecting on this earlier today in our workshop. There were times where I got on planes where I didn't know where they were going. And people would say, "Oh, well, do you want to know where we're going?" And I would say, "Yeah, show up at this hotel at 7 a.m." And then I would go, and I would be issued this paper ticket. It was handwritten ticket, and then we would just walk onto the airplane, and I would say, "Where are we going?" And they would say, "Well, it's not really on maps because they're military or government-controlled zones, and they're zones that are heavily controlled on who goes in and out." And we would land, and then we would drive 2 hours, and I would be with all these men, and I would think, oh my gosh, I hope that I have separate sleeping quarters in these tents. There was moments of panic, but I think at the time, I was because it's so costly to carry out this research, I often thought well, I'm spending this much money to be here, so it's like this I better get really good data, to justify what I'm doing. And so at that time, nothing happened, and but I think at that time, I was just trying to figure out where people were going. And I will say that in hindsight, at the same time, I was traveling in caravans of cars with security, and the experience of visiting these sites were highly curated. And so it wasn't dangerous, but I think that was one of the biggest methodological challenges. I will say one more thing briefly, is that as a U.S. citizen, I also have to adhere to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So I actually started by working as the personal assistant to 2 different CEOs of asset management firms. And it turns out that when routine transactions in highly corrupt countries tend to be very murky, it means that you are an accessory to criminal activity. So I actually had to remove myself from inside of the firms once I started getting wind of things that were happening. So the kind of ethnography that I did was ethnography where I would follow people to the sites, but I was never in meetings because didn't want to, that was a way of removing myself from being an accessory to criminal activity. But what people said to me, I was not mandated to report, and them saying something to me about what they did didn't implicate me in any kind of criminal activity. So I would go with them to breakfast or go to dinner and debriefing, but I never witnessed the meetings or transactions. But what that also means is that in carrying out all of these interviews, I purposefully don't trace one deal from beginning to end. So if I get subpoenaed for data, or if somehow someone hacked my computer and got access to the voice audio recordings, there's no way I can't trace it and they can't trace it. So what I do is I create composite cases from the data, but I think that's a limitation as a US citizen, and I sometimes think if I was a citizen of Korea or Japan, maybe I wouldn't be constrained by the same laws, as Brooke was saying, that actually make it difficult for researchers to carry out this research.
Interesting.
Perhaps in comparison to some of you and your projects, I found access in general actually not too bad. I started off interested in this field because I was studying guest workers, so people who move to a country get paid usually low wages, work there for a long time, but have a hard time becoming citizens. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to understand the opposite? So rich people who buy citizenship in countries they've never been to. And I had heard about this in newspapers, read a little bit about it, but then I went to an industry conference. And all of these have industries around them. They're professionals that are running these things. And meeting other professionals in different parts of the world is very important for learning what's going on, what's happening in the field, different industry trends. So there'll be conferences around these sorts of things. So I went to one and I realized, wow, there's a whole world behind this. This is much, much bigger and deeper than the image that you get from reading about these programs in the newspaper. So I started tracing those and going to these conferences and meeting people at conferences. What I also found is, so these citizenship by investment programs, the way citizenship is perceived in wealthy countries, especially in the North Atlantic, so Europe, North America, is very different to the way that citizenship is perceived in a lot of other parts of the world. So there's a very big moral sort of coding to these sorts of things that you see in the West, and especially in the media coverage. And I'm a sociologist by training, so I was interested in that interface between markets and morals and how people navigate that. And so I would ask people about that and how, how do your friends respond to this, or if there's this sort of media coverage, how do you respond to this? And when I would go to places, say in Asia or the Middle East or the Pacific and ask these questions, people would be like, what do you mean? What's the issue? I remember talking to, in St. Kitts, which has had a citizenship by investment program for a very long time, I talked to a lot of locals, and only one was morally opposed to this. So in a sense, actually, I found it, so people are very interested in the image of the program and image management, and because my own agenda isn't a moral one, I just, I basically want to understand what's going on in this market. I found in many cases, people really wanted to talk to me because they want these multiple sides of the story told. That, of course, means as a researcher, I have to be very sensitive to triangulation, to the different agendas that different actors will have, and in order to kind of step back and try to understand what's going on. But I found access, in general, not too hard in terms of interviews. But what's very hard is getting basic numbers, getting countries to cough up how many people are getting citizenship through this, where are they from, what's going on here. And even countries like, for example, Ireland, freedom of information laws, you write to them and they're like, oh yeah, we don't want to, and you're like, no, but there's a freedom of information law. You have to release this. And going back and forth for months and months till they finally comply with this. And this is Ireland. The US, also very challenging. Canada, very challenging. So basic numbers can be very, very hard to get. One of the reasons for that with citizenship by investment is that dual citizenship is not allowed. It's allowed in slightly more than half the countries now, but it's not allowed in some very important countries. So China does not allow dual citizenship. India does not allow dual citizenship. There's a lot of reasons why people may be thinking about these options and why they wouldn't want this to be public knowledge. And so there's also this sort of protection thing going on, even with releasing basic numbers. This has also meant that it's been hard for me to get interviews with people who do this, especially if they're from countries that don't allow dual citizenship, because there's a lot at stake for them. So even though for me as a researcher, this is very, very valuable information to understand what are the motives. Do they think about this? Does it ever become an identity issue? That's been a real challenge for me.
So I want to turn to questions in just a couple of minutes from the audience, but before we do, I want to throw out one more brief question to our panelists, which is to think a little bit about the unanswered questions that came up in your research. And if you didn't have any limitations, if you didn't have access problems, legal problems, libel laws and so forth, what would you really like to study? Right? What topics are still out there, or what did you discover that you would like to follow up on, either in a future study or a kind of a fantasy study? So I'll throw that out to whoever wants to take it first, and then the rest of you can think about it.
I'll have a first go. I mean, I would really like to get enough money to make me a kleptocrat and then see how to launder it. I'm a great fan of... You find out things by doing them. And I can kind of go shopping in a small way. I don't have enough money. It's like Brooke was saying, I don't have enough money to go shopping for this stuff in a big way. That would be quite fun. And I think that would be, I can do the kind of penny ante shopping, and the thought is, well, okay, I get this sort of answer if I'm playing with a small amount of money. How would the answer be different if I had $100 million? Would it be different at all? I suspect it would, but I would like to confirm that suspicion.
Great.
I'm just going to say, actually, I thought a lot about this as I was doing this, because our research budgets are not, I felt like I had to spread my research budgets and most of it was spent on travel. But that also meant that I stayed in like really nasty 4-story walk-ups in Myanmar, and like the one morning I stepped on a cockroach and I was just like, I've had it. But I often think, if I had won the lottery, well, I would just love to try to do this and figure out. But what's really interesting though, that's related to this, is that because the people that I study imagine themselves as small players in a much larger world of offshoring, and I think they imagine themselves as aspiring to do the kinds of things that the people that Brooke studies are doing. And so the way in which many of them think that they're going to amass huge amounts of money to play in that 1% world is through cryptocurrencies. And so what's been really interesting, particularly in studying people in less developed economies, is the amount of money that is invested in Bitcoin early on when it was $1,400 and everyone's telling me to buy. I missed that boat. But now blockchain technologies and they have put a lot of money, and I think many people in third world economies are the drivers behind cryptocurrencies. And so I think that when I think about where my project is going next, it's probably going to go in that direction, because it's one of the areas where institutions came to the market after people. And so, and if you look at the volume of trading, sometimes when I have a hard time falling asleep, the trading is very quiet when the US is awake, but when the US is asleep and East and Southeast Asia is awake, the trading the needle moves quite a bit. And so I think that, that's, I don't know, one of the areas that I think the people that I study imagine to be able to amass a lot very quickly to play out Jason's fantasy.
Great.
There are these things called free ports. They're storage lockers for the ultra-rich, where the rest of us might get a U-Haul or a Pelican storage locker and put old books or winter clothes in there. They put in Rembrandts and gold bars and God knows what. If I could sort of recapture my own anonymity, I would go get myself a job in one of those places and find out what really goes down. Because what I heard from the wealth managers I interviewed, and I talked to 65 of them in 18 tax havens, that's sort of, it's a frontier area. They place these free ports. Governments intentionally build them as sort of law-free zones. They're like the Wild West. Anything goes. Whatever the law outside the ring fencing of the free port
Are they physically warehouses? What are they?
Yes, they're ultra luxury warehouses. They're the storage equivalent of luxury real estate, climate controlled, temperature controlled, under ultra secure security. They exist outside the airports in Geneva, in Zurich. They're building one in New York under Mayor de Blasio. I believe there must be one in London. There's one in Shanghai. You would only really know about them if you were a potential client or a geek like one of us. But the more that governments try to crack down and track down ultra high net worth law evaders, where the focus is on financial crimes, cash and financial securities, which can be tracked through a paper trail, the more incentive these people have to put their wealth in fungible forms. It's sort of a paradox. The more possible it is to have your money in crypto, the more incentive people have to put their wealth in old-fashioned forms. Gold bars, Rembrandts, art. Paul Manafort and his Oriental rugs, things that can actually be held in your hand and transferred basically in secret off the books in the safety of this little Freeport environment. What I hear from wealth managers is that the more surveilled wealthy people feel, the more cracked down upon they feel, the more inclined they are to put their wealth in these old analog forms, because tax authorities are not hip to that yet. And it's a way that's very hard to track wealth holdings. So expect to see more leaks coming out of free ports, not just tax havens.
No, thanks very much for that heads up. Kristen, do you have anything on your bucket list?
Yeah, what's up next? I will probably do more on residence by investment programs. So it wouldn't be too surprising that most countries will give a residence permit to a business person wanting to build a company or invest in a country, and that would be sort of an entrepreneurial thing where the idea is a person is bringing what sort of, some sort of skill that they have as a business person. That's a little bit different from what's known often as passive investment, where you just sort of put your money there. Other people might be doing the work, the wealth managers or whatever, dealing with it, but you're not bringing some sort of what would be known as human capital or, your own skill, but your own money and putting it in a country and getting residence or permanent residence for that. Those programs, those sorts of options are actually pretty common. And it's been interesting to see the development of those, how they're responded to by things like the European Union, what the impact is on real estate. Is there an impact or not? There's been a lot of money going into real estate around the world in global cities, even without these sorts of programs. So I'm interested in that interface that goes beyond citizenship to these kind of alternative routes of securing mobility.
That seems to be a theme, especially in places, Canada and the UK, sort of this kind of meme out there that real estate has become so expensive, A, because of Airbnb, right? But B, because, there's all this foreign money coming in for these investor programs and buying these units up. But do we actually have data on that? Do we know for sure?
It is possible, but in most cases, you can invest in real estate anyways. You don't need these investor programs. So if you want to look at the extent to which the investor programs are destabilizing real estate markets, the numbers are way too small to have a real impact. So it's a slightly more complicated story than the one that you would get just by saying, oh my God, I can't live in New York anymore because of the EB-5 program.
Right. Perfect. Okay, so let's open it up now to the audience and your questions. So just a reminder, we are on the record and going on YouTube, so bear that in mind when you ask your question, and just please identify and introduce yourself for the panelists. Thank you.
Hi, great panel, extremely interesting. My name is Laurel, and I'm interested in situating this more in the historical context over time and the impact on maybe some of the laws that we see, specifically privacy laws. Is the tremendous concern that these people have for keeping secret and invisible impacting privacy laws like the 2014 Right to be Forgotten and the GDPR? Is that driving some of this?
Interesting question. Privacy, yep.
Nah, they're way ahead of that. I think those privacy laws are great. As someone who lived in Europe until about 5 months ago, they're fantastic. But rich people who wanted to be forgotten and anonymous and secret, they already employed people to keep them off the Forbes rich list, for example. Literally, there are people whose whole job is to keep your name as rich person out of the news, including off the rich lists. So often, if you see those publicized rich lists, like the kind of thing Donald Trump wants to be on, what you're actually seeing is a list of people who want to be known as rich, which is quite a different thing than people who actually are rich. So it's been discovered that many of the people who are on that list, including Trump, but not limited to him, also our Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, they fibbed. They don't have nearly the assets they say they do. It's a marketing exercise. God forbid you should ever be in the news for having a lot of money, because what will happen is people will come out of the woodwork either to ask loans from you or to offer you business deals or to extort you or to kidnap you. You do not want to be out in the public view at all. And so for decades, rich people have employed folks to scrub the world of their names.
Jason, you want to get in on the privacy question?
Yeah, just briefly, I suppose that a lot of the attraction of both kind of classic offshore products is anonymity, but I think that this shouldn't be used as a way to delegitimize things like GDPR or privacy laws there, and I think that, as Brooke said, there tends to be one sort of law for the 99% or the 99.9%. But the people who are most invested in this kind of thing have got private help. They don't rely on the government or legislation for this. And in that sense, yeah, they're kind of way ahead of the game.
Great. You had a question? Yes, please, sir. Yeah, just wait for the mic to come. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Belgasem. I come from a country named Tunisia in North Africa. We've had a corrupt regime that's ruled for 23 years, and we've overthrown it in 2011. Well, it's working out just kind of. And my country has been trying to get the resources that our president, I mean, it's all over the world. They've managed to run some of the money, but now my country is trying to recover some of that money for 8, 9 years now, and it's come to no avail. I mean, what do you think? My question is to Jason. What do you think of the legality of all of this with relation to corrupt countries? I mean, they're trying to ask Switzerland, multiple countries, Saudi Arabia too. I mean, we haven't successfully covered anything meaningful for our people. I mean, it's our people's money, and we need that money to build a future. So, yeah, thanks.
Thank you. That's a great and a really important question. And Jason, I know you have some real views on asset recovery in the regime, so maybe start with you and anyone else who wants to take that.
Yeah, briefly, certainly the logical thing is, well, if you've been ruled by a highly corrupt regime and that money has gone somewhere else, you want it back, and very reasonably. Tunisia wants it back, and indeed there's the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. The centerpiece of that is this principle of return of stolen assets. Again, as I was saying, just because you put something in a convention or a law doesn't mean it's necessarily going to happen. And I have to say that the French government has been extremely complicit in being a willing and amenable host for money looted from many Francophone regimes particularly, and indeed to this day still does. I think in some ways Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates have been even worse in their willingness to host the stolen money. I think that one of the great disappointments of asset recovery is that it's a long and expensive road, and unfortunately the difficulty and expense of this has been underplayed, which has, I think, understandably led to a great deal of disillusionment. Just by way of example, people might kind of vaguely remember the overthrow of the Duvalier regime in Haiti in 1986, or the Marcos regime in the Philippines in the same year. Asset recovery efforts are still ongoing for both of those families. So unfortunately, I think it's a very difficult process. I think if there is an optimistic note, that one of the surprisingly effective routes has in fact been NGOs. So in France, Transparency International France and Sherpa, who have led the effort against looted wealth in this country, but also that private firms, particularly law firms acting on a kind of bounty hunter basis, have surprisingly often been more effective than governments using traditional state-to-state international legal remedies.
Can I weigh in on
please.
why that is?
Yeah.
Governments have to, their hands are largely tied. Governments are underfunded compared to the wealth management industry. The best and the brightest go to work in the private sector and not for the government. And governments, at least nominally, are supposed to obey their own laws, whereas people on the private sector side, they have much more freedom to move. And so the private bounty hunters, typically they have more money, they have more financial incentives to attract the bright minds, and they're not as constrained as governments are in their techniques for getting the money back. And that may have been one of the reasons, say, Nigeria was somewhat successful. It didn't take them decades to get back about $30 million that the regime of General Sani Abacha placed in the Channel Islands and in Switzerland. So in the last couple of years, they've clawed back a fair amount of money. $30 million isn't peanuts. I'm sure there's a lot more out there, and it will take a lot more time to get it back. But you might be better off hiring a private bounty hunter than expecting a government to do it.
I think I want to add to that too, because I teach this class called States, Markets, and Bodies, and I walk the students through the 2008 financial crisis. And in the 2008 financial crisis, Wall Street bonus payouts were in the order of $300 million. And we're now at 2018, and we just witnessed a $12 billion heist through 1MDB. And if you don't know about that, there's this great book called Billion Dollar Whale, and it maps out this entire structure. It's very well written by 2 journalists. And in 1MDB, with the $12 billion heist, only $700 million went into Najib's, the Prime Minister of Malaysia's, personal coffers. And this, Goldman Sachs made $600 million off of it, and there were a lot. And Timothy Leisner, who was their fall guy, made $10 million on $12 billion, right? So, I think that when you look at this on a much broader scale, it's not just governments, but it was the people that were exactly what Brooke was saying, the people that facilitate this move that actually lined their pockets in deeper and grander ways. And by the way, Joe Lowe, the conspirator of all of this, who used to hang out with Leonardo DiCaprio and Paris Hilton and Kanye West, he's not in jail.
Great. I think we have time for another couple of questions, if there's anyone. Please.
Hi. Really enjoyed the panel tonight. My name's Sam Weeks. I'm a professor at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia. And my question is about sort of the relation of the activity you study to the idea and the practice of capitalism. So do you feel that the activities you study is the essence of capitalism or a perversion of it? Thanks.
That's great. Maybe you start with Krista, because you were making some comments today in the workshop about the relationship between states and markets in unexpected ways.
Yeah, actually, to really answer that question, I'd have to be a little bit more reflective and take some time to really think about an answer. I often get asked about whether the quote-unquote sale of citizenship is neoliberal. In a sense where markets take over functions that were formerly non-market functions, and the economy gone wild and that sort of thing. And in a way, like, if you don't really understand what's going on, it might seem that way, but when you begin to look at the dynamics and the different actors and the different perspectives on it, you see that actually neoliberal is a label that doesn't really account for a lot of what's going on. I think what I'm looking at is sort of a fuzzy, blurred relationship between what might be seen in some languages as a state actor and what would be seen in others as a private non-state one, and there's sort of a sharing of functions, blurring of functions, private actors doing state-like activities, state actors taking ideas and doing things that private actors were doing. But in terms of the global, in a sense, inequalities among states. We often, in political theory, think of states as these, units that have different things, and you can line them up, and these are all kind of equal things. They're not in terms of the way they operate in a world system. So for example, when if I talk to one of the interviews I did in St. Kitts with a local person, what do you think of the sale of citizenship? He was like, his answer was in brief something like, why do we have citizenship in St. Kitts? Citizenship is a European idea. Why do we have St. Kitts in the first place? Well, it's because Europeans went over, colonized Africa, started the slave trade, and pillaged their way to economic success. So now we have the country of St. Kitts, and we have citizenship here. And it was actually the island of Nevis was the center of this is where all the slave ships came in the first place. So this history of slavery and the islands of St. Kitts and Nevis is very, very tight. And he said, what are we doing in St. Kitts? We're selling citizenship, but we're not raping, pillaging, and plundering our way to economic success through it. And so when you start thinking about what this means in different, the different sorts of leverage that actors have within these systems, I think it becomes much more complex than just saying, this is the market run wild and they're taking over things. I think it is a complicated story. It's obviously very, very much related to capitalism. I mean, one of the reasons why you have the growth of concentrations of wealth in places like China, Russia, et cetera, is the movement of this form of economic activity into new places. But that's why, in order to really answer your question, I'd have to be much more reflective about it.
Any other thoughts on offshore as the latest stage of capitalism? What do you think?
Just briefly, in terms of plugging books, I think Ronan Palan, who's in the audience, has written the book that answers this question on the offshore world. And this is the idea of, we have a borderless global economy, but sovereignty is fragmented, and that creates a lot of friction. And in some ways, offshore is one of the things, or one of the devices that helps at least reduce that friction or reconcile this kind of parceling out of sovereignty versus the increasingly borderless nature of the global economy.
Great. Well, I think we've covered a lot of terrain, and I think that's a pretty good place to pause. I won't say end the discussion, because the discussion is always ongoing on this topic. So I just want to take a moment to thank again our really generous hosts, the Columbia Center, Global Center in Paris, and to thank our panelists for just this absolutely fascinating set of insights into their work, and to thank all of you for coming on this very rainy day. We appreciate the audience. So thanks again, everyone, and we'll stick around for a little while if anyone has some questions they'd prefer to ask informally. Thank you.